Okay, so this is my natural selection and sexual dimorphism final project. So first off, we're going to talk about natural selection and adaptation. So for some background information, natural selection was first proposed by Darwin in 1859. He had 5 observations that led to 3 inferences. So his first observation were that populations had to have the potential to increase exponentially. But his second observation was that populations generally remain stable once they reach a certain size. And his third observation were that natural resources were limited. And that's kind of the whole ecology kind of aspect of his observations, which led to inference 1, being not all offspring produced survive and reproduce because of the struggle for resources, because of the natural resources limited. And then observation 4 is that individuals in a population are not identical. They can vary in many characteristics. And observation 5 are that many characteristics are heritable, aka they are passed from parent to offspring. And those were his 2 observations about heredity. And those 2 led to inference 2. Some individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce than others because of their heritable traits. These 2 inferences led to inference 3, and that is kind of the inference that is known as evolution by natural selection, and that is there are differences in survival and reproduction among individuals are non-random, with some traits being passed on at a higher rate than others and increasing the proportion of the population from one generation to the next. So then what is kind of the current definition of natural selection, you may be wondering? Gregory wrote a paper in 2009. It was called Understanding Natural Selection, Essential Concepts and Misconceptions. And I really liked this definition of natural selection, and it is natural selection is a non-random difference in reproductive output among replicating entities, often due indirectly to differences in survival in a particular environment, leading to an increase in the proportion of beneficial heritable characteristics within a population from one generation to the next. So what does this actually mean? There is a struggle for existence. Organisms, they have exponential, a species will have exponential population growth. That is always a potential. But at some point, the environment is not fit for any more organisms of that species to exist. And so there is a struggle for that existence. There is kind of competition there. And then kind of the second part of that is that variation is key to natural selection. Without variation that can be inherited, there can be no evolutionary change because nobody would be different. And so this variation can come either as mutations or recombination. So thinking about these 2 things, the struggle for existence and the variation in different organisms with traits better suited to their environment will have more offspring that survive the environment on average. So if an organism has a trait that makes it more suited to its environment, and it's more likely to survive to the age in which it will reproduce and have offspring. And those offspring, if the trait is passed on to them, their offspring are more likely to survive to that age to have offspring as well. Whereas an organism that is less suited to its environment is less likely to reach that age of sexual maturity where it can have offspring, and its offspring are less likely to reach that age of sexual maturity. So that's kind of how traits that are better suited to the environment become more prevalent in the organisms in that environment. So then there is a specific type of natural selection known as sexual selection. The definition of sexual selection is Sexual selection is any selection that arises from fitness differences associated with non-random success in the competition for access to gametes for fertilization. So basically, that means natural selection as a whole is talking about kind of fitness in being able to survive the environment and mate and produce offspring. Sexual selection is specifically talking about successes in mating that lead to offspring. And so there are kind of two types of sexual selection fitness. There is pre-copulatory mating success, and we will get into that because the example that I'm talking about is a pre-copulatory mating success fitness trait. But those can be competition for mates through displays of behavior, displays or physical traits. And then there's post-copulatory fertilization success. So, two examples of that is sperm competition and cryptic female choice. So this is kind of pre-copulatory mating success is like, can the male win over the female, or can the female win over the male and they mate together. Post-copulatory fertilization success is, okay, they've mated, but it is about the sperm finding the egg, kind of, so to speak, or the gametes finding each other and actually being fertilized. So sperm competition is one male's direct action on the semen of another male. So kind of sperm competition within the female. And cryptic female choice, honestly, it's not very well studied, but it is females' bias towards sperm traits. So it's thought that specific chemicals that a female might release after mating might cause some sperm traits that the female thinks are better to be chosen over other traits. And then these interactions between the sexes that can influence fertilization is called mate choice. And that's when one sex competes to be chosen by another, which arises from these non-random patterns of mating and fertilization success. So now on to my example of the pre-copulatory mating success, and that is sexual dimorphism, specifically sexual dichromatism in frogs. And so sexual dimorphism is when the two sexes of a species differ in an external feature or behavior. So an external feature could mean the size, color, shape, appendages. Behavior could be scent production, sound production, so like bird mating calls. But we will be focusing specifically on sexual dichromatism, which is difference in color between the sexes of the species. Body size is the most prevalent form of sexual dimorphism in frogs, and sexual dichromatism was actually originally thought to be a lot more rare, but it has actually now been documented in over 120 species. And there are two types of sexual dichromatism in frogs. We will get into like these two types, like specifically what they mean, but with there's also three different classes. So there's bright males mating with drab females, which is represented by the gray bar in this graph, and that leads to male competition fighting for female choice. So the females are kind of picking who they're mating with, and the males are competing with each other to get the attention of a female. And that happens in both dynamic and ontogenetic frogs. Then there is bright females with drab males, and this is represented by the hashed bars. And this is a sex role reversal, so it is two females fighting, or more than two females fighting for male attention and the male choice. And then there is equally conspicuous but different colors or patterns. So it could be a bright male that is green and a bright female that is yellow, but still they look different, but they're equally conspicuous. And this is mutual mate choice. So both females and males are fighting within each other to get the attention of the other sex. And this actually only happens in ontogenetic frog species. And so what is ontogenic and dynamic? What does that mean? So ontogenic dichromatism is when one sex undergoes a color change when reaching sexual maturity. It occurs from both natural selection and sexual selection. This is actually very interesting. So it occurs from sexual selection because the drab females are more likely to pick bright-colored frogs, and drab males are more likely to pick brighter-colored frogs. So that causes that kind of sexual selection because they are favoring kind of the brighter partner in that case. But it can also occur from natural selection because, and specifically in toxic frogs, because bright colors also serve as aposematic signaling. So that means that it is signaling to predators that this frog is toxic, do not eat it. So that is kind of how it occurs from both natural selection and sexual selection. And the ontogenetic dichromatism is much more common than dynamic dichromic frogs. There are 92 ontogenic frog species, while there are only 31 dynamic frog species. Dynamic is kind of a little bit more complicated. This is only driven by sexual selection. It is a temporary color change that coincides with mating season. The duration of the color change depends on the species, and the color change occurs by the frogs modulating their pigment distribution.